what does organic really mean? And of course, this is kind of lowest common denominator of what organics has become. And so it doesn't necessarily mean all that much. In its highest incarnation, it means a whole lot, but there's a really vast disparity of practices that are all kind of labeled as organic. And so I thought, I want to grow my own food.
Welcome, everybody, back to another episode of Woven Wings Live. Today, we are hosting Stephen Wynbrandt, who is the creator of Wynbrandt Farms in sunny Los Angeles, California. And our focus today is from waste to nourishment, building the soil of our lives. And I think this episode would benefit from just a little extra framing from us today, because Stephen, our guest, is a top-notch compost maker. He is a compost expert. As I noted, I'll introduce him more later. And our focus really today is about, yes, learning about compost, but it's really also engaging with many of the surprising things that composting as a practice gives insight into for us into other areas of our lives as well. And so we'll be talking about compost and getting our hands dirty with that, and also thinking about composting as a metaphor. What does that really mean for us, and why is it important to think about as we go into our life? So with that in mind, I just want to bring on my co-host, as always, Rahul Didwania. Rahul, it's awesome to be with you again. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this notion of composting, of waste being transformed into nourishment and building the soil of our lives. What does that spark for you?
Thank you, Gabe. What it takes me back to is when I first learned about composting, which was actually in college at Berkeley. And I think, I remember just being introduced to this idea, and Berkeley being what it is, and just the Bay Area more generally, there's always this emphasis on composting, on recycling, on, trying to reduce what we use, and just the, whether it's actually done properly in practice or not. I think there is at least a conversation and an encouragement towards conscientiousness in that regard that I've always found interesting. And I think for me, the most interesting part of this topic is finding a way to really like integrate the philosophy, right, of this idea of turning waste into nourishment, both in practice, in the way that we relate to waste, but also metaphorically, right? And I think really thinking about that as it relates to the opposite forces that are often in play, right? Which is convenience, which is optimization, time efficiency at the expense of waste, and how those pathways have sort of been created for us in a certain way as well. And so I think really just wanting to go deeper and engage with this topic as a way to bring more of it into my own life. So yeah, those are just a few things that it sparks for me. Curious what it sparks for you, Gabe, or if you have any reactions to what I just shared there.
I think it's as we deepen into the 21st century and the climate crisis continues, right, and deepens, I think that these practices that have been popular in, kind of liberal bastions like Berkeley and things like that, they're becoming more and more imperative, and I think the state of California has just passed a law recently requiring composting across the entire state. And I think there's more and more of an awareness that we really do need to address these issues if we're going to be able to have some sort of sustainability as we face the future. And for me, I think the biggest thing that sticks out to me at the moment, and I will just touch on it because I think Stephen's going to have a lot more to say about all of it, but there is something miraculous about waste turning to nourishment. The fact that it's almost like a resurrection motif or something, it's like the things that are ruined, that are wasted, if we work with them correctly, can emerge into new life and into unexpected forms. They can become new things from what they were before, and that through our conscious attention and intervention, that there can be a transformation that makes life possible. And so I think that is just a really potent idea that can have all sorts of different applications. Before I start ranting about that, I'm gonna pause it because I think Stephen's gonna have a lot of nice things to say about it. So on that note, I want to introduce Stephen Wynbrandt, who's the founder of Wynbrandt Farms. established in 2009. And it's a micro farm that has become a one-of-a-kind gem of urban agriculture in Los Angeles, and is celebrated locally by many of LA's most esteemed garden professionals and connoisseurs. And Wynbrandt Farms is known for remarkable results, especially of its compost and its signature growing techniques, the quality and quantity of its vegetable production, and its wildly passionate king of compost, quote unquote, which is how Stephen's been described in the LA Times. Stephen has been on this journey for over a decade now, over 13 years. I met him early on in this journey when we were doing a farming fellowship together in Connecticut, and Stephen's only deepened and professionalized since we got to share that period of time together. He's become a lifelong friend of mine, and I'm very grateful to have him in my life. His exuberance, just to, again, name these kind of layers of symbolism with compost. I think Stephen's exuberance has struck me and inspired me in a range of environments. Stephen showed up at my wedding and was just a tornado of help, putting out all sorts of different fires and crises and helping clean up, full of just this inspiring energy. And so that's often how I feel when I interact with Stephen. Stephen, I'm delighted that we get to have you on the show today. It's been a few months in the making. Yes, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Gabe. You wouldn't know because I was just muted, but I just laughed a whole lot and shed a couple tears as well. Thank you so much for that introduction.
So I guess I'm curious, like, just as a starting point, if you could just share with us and our listeners a little bit of what got you started in composting. What inspired you, and what has the journey been like from that beginning to where you are now?
Much of the decade of my 20s, I got as far away from LA, from my hometown, as I could in the world. And I adventured in the Himalayas of Nepal, in East Africa. I studied abroad. I worked a lot, worked abroad, did a lot of traveling abroad. And at the end of my last travel adventure in 2009, when I was 29, I came back to my childhood family home in West LA, and I knew that I wanted to build something, start building the castle and become more rooted, pun intended. And there are endless puns in this journey. And I wanted to work with my hands and create something. And I was standing in the kitchen, looking out the kitchen window to this backyard that I grew up archaeological digging and kicking soccer balls and having parties. And I wanted to make it productive. I wanted to transform it. And I would tell the story for many years that I decided for every reason under the sun that I wanted to grow food. And I did decide that, but really I wanted to see if I could make money off the backyard. I wanted to see if I could. And then I thought growing stuff. And I thought, well, even many years before, an awareness developed in me about eating pure, whole, clean, unadulterated food. And in the years prior, shopping even at farmers markets, sometimes like the people who were growing it weren't necessarily the ones selling it. And I didn't really know what questions to ask. What does organic really mean? And of course, this is kind of lowest common denominator of what organics has become. And so it doesn't necessarily mean all that much. In its highest incarnation, it means a whole lot, but there's a really vast disparity of practices that are all kind of labeled as organic. And so I thought, I want to grow my own food. I want to see if I can make money doing it, and creating an urban mini farm. And I had never grown anything in my life. There was this shaded field of weeds and 50-foot trees. It's like all shade backyard and just 3-foot tall grasses and weeds. It's a beautiful little 40-foot by 60-foot pasture. But yeah, I wanted to see if I could grow lots of food and create local economy and just understand how food is grown and where it comes from, and be more connected to my food on the land that I'm most connected to. And yeah, see if I could take the super out of supermarket and create local economy and just be the change that I want to see in the food system. And I asked my mom if I could build a little garden in the backyard. And little did she know, I had this vision that I really kept a secret because I had no idea if I could do it. But I had this vision of planting every square inch in food and like farming the backyard. And she saw me day after day and week after week, hoeing up all the weeds and cutting big branches of these trees. And she said, "Wow, you're really serious about this." And then I asked her if I could cut the vast majority of these trees to make this all shade backyard into all sun. And she said, "Well, okay, I see you're really serious about it. So do what you need to do." And I said, "But we can't cut the trees. They're these beautiful, glorious Chinese elms. And I grew up with them. And I don't know, maybe they decrease the value of the house." And she said, "Well, don't cut them then. Don't cut them." And I said, "But we got to have sunshine." She said, "Cut them, cut the trees." I hired this amazing acrobat monkey tree trimmer. He's up 50 feet in the trees and swinging tying ropes off to different branches and lowering them down. And it took me a few months of stacking up over 10,000 pounds of logs and shipping off all the weeds in the green bin. I may have done it differently now that I know all that I know, but it was wonderful what I did. And about that time that I was ready to start cultivating the skin of the earth in the backyard, that I was introduced to this man named Michael Capel, who learned from pioneer organic biodynamic farmers at UC Santa Cruz in the 1970s. He lives right here in West Los Angeles. He's maybe one of the best people I could have met in California. Took me under his wing. He propelled me eons ahead of where I would have otherwise been as a newbie farmer. He said, "Dig really deep in your earth. We're going to do biointensive double dug beds. You dig really deep the first time and mix compost in really deeply, and then potentially you never have to dig again." And he said, "I'm going to walk you through making thousands of pounds, even 10,000 pounds. I made 20,000 pounds of compost before I ever even cultivated the earth." And he said, "People are going to think you're nuts, but I see you. You've got it in you. You're going to grow the most amazing food people have ever seen." And sure enough, half a year later, when this first compost was ready, and I dug these beds, they looked like mass graves, 4.5 feet wide, 15 feet long, and like 2 feet deep. I took all the earth out, put it through a 1/4 inch screen, sifted all the rocks, got all the clods into small pieces of this clay earth that was bean fields before there was a little house here in the 1940s that a movie star lived in. And I mixed it 50-50 with compost that I made. And that first season that I grew, there were veteran permaculture designers and edible garden builders who came into the backyard and said, "What the heck are you doing back here, kid?" And they would become, later on, years later, they would become my best compost clients when I started making compost professionally. So that's the beginning of my journey that would soon turn into a passion and a calling and the central mission of my life. And my career now has included everything from teaching workshops on the methods and techniques that I use to grow lots and lots of food beyond organically, really, really well in the urban environment. And it translates to suburban and rural environments and row crops and fields, farming fields, to growing specialty greens for chefs and restaurants in Los Angeles, consulting, garden building. And when I started making compost 3 years after I started my agricultural journey, I met elder biodynamic compost master who is from a lineage of some of the world's most dedicated biodynamic compost masters that dates back directly to Rudolf Steiner, the founder of biodynamic agriculture, and Farmer Jack, who left his body in this past year. He took me under his wing and said, "I'm going to make you my protege and teach you everything I know." And I spent a year studying and learning with him. I spent more time with him than I did all of my friends and family combined in his little mobile home on the bluffs of the Pacific Palisades, looking out at the vast Pacific Ocean, studying the agriculture course, Rudolf Steiner's original lectures, and more so than that, making compost first with him in my backyard. I said, "Mom, I met this legend, and I want to bring a couple thousand pounds of cow manure and a few bales of alfalfa into my backyard and make this special compost." And she threw her hands up and she said, "What am I going to say? No, you've already," she gave me carte blanche to do what I wanted to do with the backyard, and bless her heart. A quick story about that in just a moment. But after I made this compost with Jack And I said, wow, people can't get anything like this. I would love to make this available for people. And I felt like I had found the gold at the end of the rainbow. And I'll talk more about that and just how much I value all that compost is and how compost works and what it does for the living skin of the earth and for human health and vitality and for the climate.
Yeah, and Stephen, that piece right there, sorry just to jump in, the imagery you just had was incredible there. And I think you mentioned like, hey, through this path, like your passion and your mission and all of that sort of came out. And what I'm hearing is that, hey, there was like a level of conviction around this from the get-go, right? And now it's transformed into something truly kind of like sounds like entirely, what your life is about in such a amazing way. And what you said just now around like compost and the role of it in so many different aspects of life. Like, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, like what is that mission or that vision or that purpose, that you've alluded to a couple of times, and how did it, where did it come from, and how did you develop such strong conviction around it?
I saw how the food grew at the farm where Farmer Jack made compost, and it was the only food that I thought was more impressive, more vital, and vigorously growing and disease and pest resistant than the food in my backyard, which was rather extraordinary. And I said, I got to learn how to make this compost. I got to learn this recipe and this technique because I want to grow the most nutrient dense, disease and pest resistant, vigorously growing food. I always want to do everything the best I can do it with the most virtue. And I was just so impressed with the way the food was growing and his compost. And so when we made it here, he then said to me, when I expressed wanting to make it for others and make this available, he said, you could make 30,000 pounds back here in your backyard. And I knew at that moment what he meant, that I would make these windrows, long, narrow piles, let's say 5-6 feet wide. They could be 20 feet long, 40 feet long, 5-6 feet tall with 45-degree sloping sides. I knew he meant then that I would be making compost over all these beds that I just put all my blood and sweat and tears and spirit into. And at that moment, I knew that that's what I was going to do. And over that next year, I made over 100,000 pounds of compost in this backyard in West LA. That's tens of thousands of pounds of cow manure and dozens of bales of alfalfa. It's going down in the history of the city, where it's, whether it's ever a really famous story or not, it's monumental. And it is outlined in an article in the LA Times in 2012 called The King of Compost. So that began my professional journey making compost. And so from the beginning, I understood that really what we are doing as organic, beyond organic farmers is we are growing soil. And the best way, the single best way to do that is to make compost, and not just any old compost, but the most biologically abundant, diverse, microbially diverse, alive compost we can make for the living skin of the earth's optimal nutrition. And the intention and attention and skill and dedication that we put into the compost, those results show in how the food grows and the health of the soil. And we can look at that from a chemical perspective, from a biological perspective, from a physiological perspective, the tilth and its water holding capacity. So we can see it with our senses. We can see it under the microscope. We can understand it through various kinds of tests to measure nutrients and minerals. There are many different ways to look at it. And great compost really does all these things. And so really simply said, the healthier our soil is, and great compost elevates the health of soil. The healthier our soil is, the higher nutrition our food has, and the more nutrition we receive from our food. That connection cannot be overstated. And so I learned that at the beginning, and I experienced that eating the food, growing it and eating it from the beginning.
That part I think is really interesting, Stephen. So if I'm understanding it right, you started out wanting to grow food, and you had this vision of like you wanted to cover your mom's backyard from head to toe, every foot, you wanted to be growing food, and you did a bunch of work to do that. And then you met this compost guru of sorts, and through that you walked back the original intention to something arguably even deeper, which was the soil that the food comes from. And you gave up. I don't know if you continued growing food, but you kind of like you decided to clear out a lot of the space of your original vision to grow food all over the yard and to actually make the compost that makes the soil that grows the food. And to me, this is very significant, because if I think about like the food in this context is kind of like, very literally the fruits of our labor, right? The fruits of your labor, and you get to eat it, and it's a nice experience. But what shifted for you is that then you went back to, you went a layer deeper to, where does that food come from? What's the soil that it emerges from? That to me feels very metaphorical. It feels like something that is relevant to all of us in different ways. But I'm curious if you can just speak to that a little bit more. Like, what was that shift like for you, and the importance of doing that, of walking it back a layer deeper to the soil, and taking it to that from the original intention of the food?
Thank you for highlighting that and framing that. And you are absolutely right. And I will say that I did from the beginning with my first mentor, Michael, have that awareness, because I made all this compost. I made I think it was 20,000 pounds of compost before I ever even grew food. So I knew then that I needed it. And as my journey deepened, and when I met Jack, this whole other dimension opened up. I was really attracted to and saw so much value and worth and importance in having, like, yes, making it for other people. And I wanted to, like, how can I turn this whole thing into a career, right? And with the works, I'm doing workshops and I'm selling greens and but what's the next step in my career? And I thought it could be making this extremely potent, fertile, elevated compost. And it's been such a heck of a journey that has demanded all my spirit and might and everything I've got. And it has been extremely challenging and extremely rewarding. But yes, it really deepened. I mean, one, I will say that I wanted to make it for me. I wanted to learn his recipe for me, because it's like you can never have enough compost. You always need more. And you can mix it into soil, and you can lay it on top of soil and top dress around plants. You can liquefy it. You can put it through a finer screen and make a seed starting mix and make potting soil. There are just so many uses for it. There's so much need for it. And with really great compost, you can't use too much. My understanding deepened that's like, it's the fuel for the engine. It's the soil fertility factory. And it really should be the pride and joy, the centerpiece of the farm. It's compost operation, and how we cycle, how we take the animal manure from the farm and the cover crops that, for instance, fix nitrogen in the soil. And when we harvest them, and leaves and wood chips and all the organic matter from the farm, and cycle that through, and in that death and decay of the compost pile, there proliferates all this life to feed to the soil. And so just deepening my awareness, this importance of it, and like the scarcity of really high quality compost. It's like people couldn't even get compost like this, and it's so hard to come by. And when soil scientists and people in the organic, biodynamic, regenerative agriculture community talk about this caliber of compost, it's like, it's almost mythical. It's like, where do you get it? Where do you get compost that has all these trophic levels of microbes in it and just all this goodness in it? You almost never get it in bags on the shelf of the nursery. I saw such an important call to dedicate myself to participate in the art of making this, and see if I could do it really well and replicate it and do it again and again and again, and get it to people.
Yes, absolutely, Stephen. And I think what I love about what you said is that, yes, there's the mission and the component of compost as a sustainable and nourishing practice, but there's also this element for you of like opportunity, like, hey, there is this demand or this desire to have this, this product that can then be used to create high nutrient, foods, and it's not there. And I'm going to do that, and I'm going to build a practice and a career out of that. And so just wanted to note that that marriage of mission and passion and opportunity, I think is the holy grail, right? That we often seek and talk about and idolize. And it's just great to hear that that you brought both of those lenses into that, right, into this business that you've developed, or this practice and this institution that you're building. And as part of that, I'm curious if we can go even a little bit deeper into this philosophy, right? And that image that you were painting of like, hey, we're taking a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and bringing all of it together, right? I think we use the term offline of it being a very alchemical process. And just curious, like, what the philosophy is behind bringing all of these different things together, and how does it do that? How are we taking all these different things that might not even be considered useful, and transforming it into something that is so desirable, that is so high end, that is so potent and nourishing.
Wonderful. Well, a bit later in the conversation, if we have time, I'll talk more about the system and program that I've created for organizations such as schools. And I'm starting with schools because there's such an extraordinary multidisciplinary educational component to compost all of their food waste on campus, on site. And there's nothing like it being done currently that I know of. And so there's even the term waste in there. So to back up in my career, when I'm making it with these other ingredients, they are, let's see, alfalfa hay, for instance. That is the prized feed for racehorses and dairy cows. And there's a market for alfalfa hay as a very nutritious feed for animals. And I am taking it, I'm buying it, I'm essentially commissioning a farmer to grow me a compost crop to put as an ingredient, as a feedstock in my compost to make extraordinary compost. And so there are all these ingredients. All organic matter is potentially an ingredient of compost. And when we make compost, we are very much chefs in the kitchen, and we have to prepare ingredients to be composted. So, of course, a tree, anything that's organic matter, can be composted, but a tree as a log would take a really long time to decompose. And so we would chop it up into small pieces. Like we chop up an onion, we wouldn't put a whole onion into a taco. We'd chop it up into small pieces and mix it with small pieces of cilantro and then put it in the taco. So we chop up a tree. And so wood chips are an ingredient in my compost. I'm talking about this because wood chips, for instance, may not seem like something that we have to quote unquote get rid of, that has to go away, but certainly manure is. Now, manure isn't in organic farms and in organic dairies, and organic dairies should be using most or all of their manure to make compost of, and using that compost in their pastures. But with the little manure from organic dairies that is available for me to source, I source the best manure, the best shit I can in the state of California. That manure is, to some people at least, seen as quite valuable, and so valuable that they wouldn't even sell it. And I don't go shovel manure for free. I buy it from cows that are not shot up with hormones and antibiotics and eat organic feed. So that manure is quite valuable to me, and it has extraordinary virtue in compost, particularly cow manure that I use. Anyways, to bring it back, I love taking these different forms of organic matter that all have such great virtue in compost, but are perceived as like worthless. And even, if I put a bucket of wet cow manure on someone's doorstep, they would say, "Get this out of here. I don't have any use for this, and I don't want it. And it smells, and there are flies around it. And what good could this possibly be for me?" Or for anyone anywhere ever. Like, what is this? Or people in the less developed world use this to make fire and build their huts, but we don't need that. And I would say the opposite is, it's so valuable. And fast forwarding to the end of the process, that this cow manure and alfalfa hay and wood chips and all these other ingredients, like from coffee grounds to seaweed, that I use in my compost, 8 months, a year later, have decomposed, broken down into their smallest parts, which is humus. Those are the smallest particles that organic matter can get when it's fully decomposed. And it's silky, sexy, sweet, very close to soil. And it's beautiful. And it mushes together in your hand, and there's this kind of almost greasy film on your skin. And those are the microbes. That greasy film is the greasy film of microbe activity. And it's like a light clay, and it holds together in a ball. And if you hit it with your thumb gently, it breaks apart, and it smells like the forest floor. It smells like your childhood at your cousin's cabin. It smells like mountain air, like rain. And in 1 tablespoon of it are more life forms than are in the most densely packed wildlife places on the planet. The East African Serengeti, the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. And there is so much value and virtue in that. And it came from ingredients that to most people aren't perceived of having much of any value. So when I use the word alchemy, and I know that term is thrown around a lot these days, I understand it as originally in medieval times that we're taking a lead, a not precious metal, and turning it into gold, a very precious metal. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking things that most people perceive have little or no value and turning them into something that has great value. And that value is medicine for the living skin of the earth that grows food and that grows everything that thrives in rich soil very well. And also this connection here that the healthier soil is, and great compost makes soil healthier, the greater the soil's ability to sequester carbon, to trap carbon in the soil where it belongs, which is essentially potentially slowing and halting climate change. So we get all this carbon in the atmosphere, and we got to get it out of the atmosphere, and the soil is the world's greatest carbon sink.
So all of that, I think, is very powerful. I mean, just walking back again. So we started out with the fruits of the labor, right? The outcome, which I do think is very linked with kind of our traditional, like Western way of operating, our linear way of thinking. We want the outcome. I want to bite into the apple and have it be yummy. I want to take this food and cook it up, or maybe, if I really extend this like Western metaphor, I want someone else to take the food and prepare it for me into some gourmet dish, and I want to enjoy that. And you got interested in growing your own food, so being part of that process, creating a healthy version of that, and that took you back into the engagement with the soil and as that which creates the food. And then now, as you're describing the alchemical process and what's going on inside the soil, we really start to you zoom in with the microscope, right? And suddenly this, I think most people, when we think about soil and walking around, we just think about like it's the earth. It's kind of this, like, we even have an aversion to it. It's the dirt. It's the thing that we have to till traditionally, or it's just something that we don't want to be too involved with. And you're describing this transformation that's happening within that soil, where different products are turning at the microbial level into life, right? Into life organisms and into everything that it entails, including carbon sequestration. And I just keep wanting to harp on this because I feel like it's the biggest piece of this that has direct application into people's lives. Like, yes, people can, if you're listening to this, maybe this is inspiring you to get going with your own composting. But also it's so symbolic of the movement from looking at the outcome and the fruits of our labor to the process through which things are created, and taking the things that, really looking at what we've valued and devalued, and seeing how even the things that we've devalued can be made valuable through our engagement, through our conscious attention. And at the same time, within the Western culture we live in, those notions of convenience and aversion are so deeply embedded. How do you, I mean, you personally had some sort of inspiration for it But what would you say to people listening to this about how to get over the hump of relating with our trash and our waste in a way that's actually fruitful in the way that you're describing? How do we shift our desires to get that waste product away or just have the convenience of the outcome to really being engaged in the process of ongoing transformation?
These are so deep, and they're really symbolic and literal, I think, for like some of the deepest and most important questions that we need to be asking ourselves and our communities and our society about this time that we're in and where we're headed and what our vision is to live in a way that will enable humanity to thrive more. When we make compost well, when we make it as a high art, it really profound product of alchemy that holds answers to some of the most critical issues that humanity faces, from climate change to restoring and elevating the health and well-being of humanity. I think it's, at least in part, understanding how profound and direct these connections are, and just also looking at our culture, that I think this is hard stuff to talk about, and it can feel really uncomfortable and even threatening, maybe because it's threatening to our way of life, how we live here in the West, with all of these open loops. When we're making compost, when we're transforming waste, we are closing the loop on our waste, and we are taking responsibility for it. But overwhelmingly in our culture, we don't do that. And landfills are like, we don't see them, we don't know about them, they're just way far away. And I think that's where throw it away, that term, comes from. And of course, there is no away. They go to these abominations of humanity. They shouldn't exist in the first place. The landfill is an anaerobic mess. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And when there is no oxygen in these ginormous piles, then all sorts of gases are released into the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane and ammonia, and all of the trash in there does not decompose. It sits there in putrefied, rancid, anaerobic conditions. And so when we think, we can just imagine this, and we almost know this from like fantasy movies, like medieval times, that people didn't really, I mean, what was clothes that weren't used anymore, that were cut up into rags, and when those rags disintegrated, well, there was nothing to even compost. But if there was, then there was a compost pile outside of the castle walls for like the cloth clothes. And what else would there even be? Pieces of wood, and they rot, and then you chop them up small and make compost out of them. And I mean, any iron that there was, no one ever threw a sword away or anything made of iron, and they would fashion it into something else. And there just wasn't the kind of, now I don't mean to say we should go back to living in medieval times. It is wonderful, the things we have, but all these things, all this stuff, unlike in our grandparents' generation that they would use, I mean, the things that were made would last 10 times as long, right? But when those things broke and they couldn't be fixed anymore, then those parts were truly cycled again. They were recycled into something else. The screws were taken out and used. The sheets of metal were melted down. And I think that we need to get back to doing these things, to closing, and first and foremost, the easiest thing, and it is not easy, but it is probably the easiest of all the things that we need to look at, is closing the loop on our waste. And so how does that look in our society, and how much differently do we need to run our society and consume and not consume for these changes to take place? Because ultimately where I'm getting at is that I don't think, and from all the evidence that I see and research that I read, that our way of life is sustainable. I don't use that word lightly. I don't know that we know necessarily what sustainable really is, how sustainable things are. But of course, that the basic definition of that is like using our resources in a way that enables us to continue using them at the same rate in future generations. I don't think we're doing that at all right now. I think we're living really unsustainably, and really the ultimate goal is to live regeneratively so that we use our resources in a way that there are greater resources for the next generation. And so to do this, I think we need to make a lot of shifts in how we live and how we consume, and namely, taking responsibility for our consumption and the byproducts of our consumption or our waste. We can do that with our food waste. We can do it with many different things, and those are many different discussions and many different podcasts. But our food waste is like the first thing that it's like right there in front of us. It's so, I don't want to say easy, but I want to say easy. You just got to know the steps and how to put the organic matter together in a way that creates and maintains the optimal conditions for the most efficient breakdown of organic matter into humus. Is that we can do this. We can do this on a residential scale. We can do this on a organizational scale. Our schools, our synagogues and churches and mosques and our companies where 100 or 300 people are all eating lunches and they have banana peels and apple cores and the end of salami sandwiches, and it shouldn't go in the trash because there is no way. And the highest thing we can do with it actually is not ship it out on a truck that collects food waste that takes it really far away to a huge industrial composting site way far away, but keep it on site, recover it, transform it, and use it on site, on the grass, on the shrubs, in the rose garden, in the vegetable garden, donating it to community farms and urban agriculture, particularly in underserved neighborhoods. There is no one would ever have a problem finding a home for compost.
I'm very glad, Stephen, that you took it there just now, because what was going through my mind as you were talking about it, other than relating to the problem, was I was like, okay, yeah, so I have a compostable bag that I put in my freezer, right? And that's where we put food waste, and at the end of the a couple of weeks, when that bag is full, or end of a week, we'll take that bag and we'll dump it into a compost bin that our building has, right? And my question was going to be like, does that count, right? Does that count as a step in this direction? And I think what you said is, or what I took is, it might, but hey, there are actually some better ways, right? And I think what that prompted for me is a curiosity around how we as listeners, we as just people that are maybe interested and have some energy around this idea, this notion of reducing our waste, or rather putting it into more of a regenerative process, as you said, as opposed to a single unidirectional waste, throw it away, quote unquote, process. It's like, how can we engage? Like, what can we do, that really encourages that mentality? Because I'm inspired, right, by your vision, and having this conversation, I can feel my energy bubbling around it. But I can also see the possible, if not likely, outcome that it's like, hey, I take this conversation back, I think about it, I feel energized by it, but then kind of go back to life as it is, right? And society being set up the way that it is, and the that imagery you painted of the landfill, it's like, it's out of sight, out of mind, right? And how do we? So I guess the question, to really make it a little bit more pointed, is how do we not fall back into that trap, right? And what are steps that we can take to actually be active participants towards a more regenerative society?
First, I want to ask you, when your compost goes to, you said your building has a compost pile?
Yeah, it has a green compost bin, right? So there's the black, landfill bin, there's the blue recycling bin, and the green composting bin.
Because I did think for a second, when you said bring it to the compost container, I thought, oh my gosh, if it's a compost container where it is composting, not only does that count, but that's it. And something that I'm working on that is becoming much of the main focus of my career and my mission is this program and system that I've developed to compost thousands of pounds of food waste on the site of organizations, of these schools and synagogues and churches and companies. And this is for organizations, groups of people that make thousands or tens of thousands of pounds of waste annually. I see this as a key piece to creating more resilient, sustainable communities and cities and a society. This is my next mission and gift and purpose for what I believe needs to be done, the change that we need to see in the world. Putting that food waste in container can to be picked up, it's a whole lot better than nothing. And I have different feelings about this. People would often say to me and still say, oh, Stephen, if we were all doing what you're doing, if we're all growing our own food, and by the way, even though now I make lots of compost on the land, and there's been many different chapters, and making it in Northern California with large machinery, and then in the mountains of Malibu and the Santa Monica Mountains, north of Los Angeles, I still grow lots and lots of food. I don't sell so much anymore. There are just so many hours in the day and in my life, but I love to eat the fruit of my labors. When I'm working in partnership with the divine and the living skin of the earth to grow food, there's no food that is as nourishing to my body as that I participate in growing and prance out like Bambi and pick in my garden a minute before I eat it for dinner or breakfast or lunch. So people would say, oh, if we were all doing what you're doing, but some people are teachers and doctors and psychologists and all sorts of professions and lending their skills and talents giving their skills and talents to the community, and being of service. A lot of professions probably don't need to exist, but there are a whole lot that do, and that we can't all grow food. And so it'd be a little bit much to say, everyone can do this. Everyone can be out in their backyards growing food. Maybe that's not so realistic, but it is maybe realistic for our agricultural system to look very different. And that in the future, how I understand it and firmly believe, there needs to be many, 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 many more small, diversified organic farms. What we've done is consolidated these huge monocropping monoliths, with ginormous machinery to harvest hundreds of acres in hours. And I think we need to be doing the opposite. And that's truly the way that we are going to heal soil and feed the world and go into usher humanity into a more thriving future. And so I'm talking about these different themes because I do have a hunch that a lot of this is about awareness and education. And the more we understand about these global problems that have profound, effective solutions to them, the more that we want to hopefully want to feel the need and the call to be a part of. And so something like composting is I see, like, when I'm doing these programs at the schools, the children can see it and feel it and smell it. And they are concerned about climate change and they want to make a difference, and they don't know how, and people don't know how. And this is amongst the most impactful ways that we can make a difference, and that we can see and realize the results of this difference we're making. I don't know what it takes for people to visit the landfill, to read books about the details of what all is behind climate change and the various factors that led to all of these open loop systems that are becoming more and more problematic. And so, I think on the one end, there are these, it's just like, the uber rich aristocratic capitalists who could care less or not even thinking about their children, maybe, potentially, probably, to indigenous wisdom and peoples who have lived on these lands that we're in for thousands and thousands of years, and they are thinking at least 7 generations ahead. And when they plant trees, they're not doing it for them, they're doing it for their grandchildren. Trees that may not even bear fruit while they're still alive. And so, why do some people care so much about the future of humanity and other people don't? And why are some people so dedicated and so firm in their commitment to living the change that they wish to see and other people are not? I'm not quite sure. I imagine it's a combination of how they were raised and their values and their personal integrity and also education. And I will say, for me and for you and for everyone, it's hard. I mean, I choose to have one vehicle, so I don't have two. It's like I could have like a little Volt and my huge diesel truck. My diesel truck is essential for the work that I do. I choose to have one vehicle. And sometimes I drive that big, huge truck around and I'm just doing errands in the city. And I remind myself, this is a lower carbon footprint than having 2 hunks of metal and 2 fuel tanks. But do I limit the amount of time and miles that I fly on planes? They're extremely polluting. I think maybe in the future, it's like it's going to have to get so bad, and our governments, our municipalities are so far behind in regulating on this. But I see, like, in the future, I'm seeing all these visions that we're not going to be able to fly as much. And of course, it's going to go to the highest bidder, and the richest people will still be able to fly, but then even they will be able to fly less. And when our trash cans have to get smaller, and then our trash is weighed, there will be scales on the trash cans that come pick up those black bins, and you'll be charged a lot of money when it goes over 20 pounds and then when it goes over 10 pounds because the landfills are filled up and we can't be putting stuff there anymore. But the richest people will pay, but then it will be so dire. The circumstances will be so extreme that there will be no amount of money they can even pay, and that trash will have to stay on their land. Will have to stay in their backyard in Beverly Hills and pile up there. And we got these toilets. We're in a drought in California, and every time someone flushes that toilet, they're flushing gallons of water. And I'm just thinking, I'm pooping in my compost toilet. I have no sewer attached to it. And how many thousands of gallons of water am I saving a year? Just one person. And like in the future, we're not going to be able to flush our poop down the toilet. We're going to need to recover that too and transform that.
I think that the kind of dystopia that you're describing is in certain ways it's becoming more and more of a reality every day, which is a scary thought. And I think it's an important reality to name. I'm also struck in speaking with you today, Stephen, as I always am when we spend time, is that I just feel you have an exuberance to your spirit that is very unique and has driven you to pursue these interests and find success within those interests. And I guess, when I think about kind of the situation Rahul was describing earlier and that I've alluded to, is like that kind of the apathy, and the convenience. It makes me think about the movie Wall-E, especially as you're describing trash piling up everywhere and everything. It's like, and here are all of us. We're not yet in like a spaceship blimp, like floating around waiting to be able to come back to Earth. But we kind of are, like we're all in our phones, we're all on our screens. And meanwhile, the destruction of the climate and the environment is progressing. And while I was in my screen yesterday, I just saw some UN report about, how countries are not making good on their climate commitments, and that we're looking at a more and more radical future. And then I juxtapose that with your inspiration, with your energy, with the vitality that I feel kind of pours through you and drives you to do these, the work that you do. And I guess I'm curious, like, I know that some of that is innate. I think you've got that inside you. But I also get the sense that the work itself somehow charges you up. It gives you energy. Like when you talk about it, like it brings a smile to your face. It gives your voice becomes energized, and it's contagious. I can feel it too. I think Rahul was naming that also earlier. And what's the secret to that? That to me feels like part of that alchemy, right? And the composting as metaphor that we've been talking about today. There's a switch that seems to go off that for a lot of people, we're in that open loop, and it's like, then, I got to take the trash out. Oh man, I got to do that. And I'm not saying you don't sometimes feel that way, but the energy I get from you is like, now it's time to take the trash out. Wow, like, like I get to separate between these things and make gold from waste. What advice, if you have any, I don't know if you can give us any advice, but like for people struggling with that apathy and that sense that they're not quite in that same space, is there anything that you recommend that's helped you to connect more with that energy that seems to enliven you around this topic?
I love to inspire others. I love to wow people and to affect people with my exuberance and passion and sharing the things that I love to do, and especially things that I found great secrets in as like tools of life and doing things well. And it's not only agriculture, it's music and it's surfing and riding waves. And actually, all the things that I've done, my passion professional profile, I've always taught people. I'm a veteran experiential educator. And so I think there are different kinds of people, that we're not all the same, and that's beautiful and that's fine. And personality type and my drive and my constitution may be such that this is part of my role and purpose, and that other people have different roles and purposes that are just as important and can be just as or more impactful. And I want my impact to be more impactful than I may judge it to be right now. And I want to reach more people and affect more people and affect more change in the world. And I'm not sure that I know exactly where that comes from. If that's God, divine given, if that's in my DNA, if it's just, the chance. But for apathy, I just, as much as I can, I want to be the change that I want to see. I don't think that, when I go to parties and dinners and like I know they're going to be using paper plates and plastic forks, like if I just ate off that paper plate, like so what? It's just one more paper plate. But I just feel trashy when I'm eating on paper that I know is going to go to the trash. I feel trashy. And when I bring my own plate, my own silverware, I feel classy. And when people say, "Oh, you're doing that like to be green, huh?" It's like, no, I feel trashy when I eat off that like single use stuff, and I feel classy when I eat. And so it's, what I'm doing, I'm saving one paper plate, but people see it and people are affected by it. And I like to affect people and make people think and question and push the envelope and maybe say controversial things and wake people up and wake myself up and keep myself awake and hold myself to a higher standard that I can be more and better. And it's hard and it takes energy. And sometimes with every decision, every vote that I make, in other words, every dollar that I spend, I'm like, where is this going to? Is this going to something that I want to see more of in the world, or something that I want to see less of? And I try and put less dollars into the things that I want to see less of in the world. And that's very challenging. And even just living here in the society, it can feel conflicting. But I would say on the flip side that there is so much, we take our power back when we make informed decisions, and when we pay attention to what the obvious effects of those decisions are. And so with my plate, I can say, hey, it's only one less plate when I'm doing it, but what if everyone were doing this? And what if, at the schools I'm at in these composting programs, they're so incredible and they're going even better than I dreamed they would. And the students are already seeing that. Like, I mean, first they were very excited, the youngest kindergartners, to feed the compost pile, and they would want to donate their whole apple to be composted. And I said, that's so sweet of you. That's so thoughtful. And let's eat the apple. If you're not done with the apple, take the apple home. You could eat it the next day. If you don't eat it and you're sick of apples for the week, maybe you can make applesauce out of it. Or, okay, if you're not going to eat it, you could feed it to your dog. Little apple's good for your dog. The very, very last resort, and I love this, I love doing this, but it's the last resort, is composting it. And so I think that the more, involved we are in these decisions, the more conscious the decisions are, potentially we feel like we're making a difference. And when we feel like we're making a difference, we feel relevant. And I think it's important for humans to feel relevant. When the less relevant we feel, the less life force we have. And when we're not relevant anymore, we die. And we want to stay relevant and be really relevant. And so I think I am always looking for things. And I have found it in agriculture and composting and teaching others how to compost and implementing it on an organizational scale, and singing songs with kids and families and teaching people how to ride waves, one of the most awesome, powerful forces in nature, that like I feel relevant. So when we are giving our our energy and sharing our passions and talents and helping people, then we feel relevant. So hopefully taking these various kinds of actions to take responsibility for our waste, to lower our carbon footprints where we can. I mean, it's hard. We don't take the plane flight. We know, oh, those other people are flying everywhere they want for vacation. Why should I stop flying? But maybe there are some more places that we can visit, national parks more locally, and consolidate. And it's hard. I don't want to point the finger, because whenever I point the finger, there are at least three fingers pointing back at me, But also, I have to be the change that I want to see in the world, even when it's the hard thing to do. And sometimes it feels like a game, and sometimes it feels like a job. And I never want a job. I never want a job. I never want to work a day in my life. But I feel the weight of the world, and I feel that responsibility, and different people have different constitutions. So in a way, I wish everyone were like me. I wish everyone felt that weight of the world, but nah, if everyone was like me, it'd be boring, and we can't have that.
Stephen, thank you for that answer. Because, I mean, there's just so much there that to sift through. And I think what's not lost on me is that the last couple of questions, right, that Gabe and I were asking were really, really oriented towards like, hey, how do we get out of this convenience loop? How do we activate ourselves? How do we challenge apathy, right? And it's like what you said is very striking and very clear, right? Which is like, hey, there's no silver bullet, right? It starts with engagement, and to what you just said, like it's not easy, but the more you act in the way you want to act and model the life that you want to model, and allow that to emanate outwards, not imposing, but just being that way, it creates this feedback loop. And Gabe and I often talk about this idea that like engagement is what it is. Like when we talk about weaving, woven wings, it's like it's about engagement. It's about bringing that action and that intention and bringing it to life. And just wanted to say, as we start to approach the close here, that I like really appreciate not just the way that you spoke about it and speak about it in general, but the way that you model that with what you do. And I can certainly say from my end that I feel energized by that right now, and feel inspired by that, and feel some of the effects of that exuberance that Gabe was talking about. And it leads me to want to start small, right? And think about my own ways of bringing that into life, and making it a lifestyle, right? Rather than it being a deferred desire or something like that. It's more like, no, it's all part of kind of what we want to achieve and who we want to be in the world and how we want the world to be. So that was all just a rambling reaction there, but just what I was feeling there. And Gabe, I'll turn it over to you, just as we kind of wrap up here, but just wanted to share my bit there.
I really appreciate that. And something that really stuck out to me with what you said, Stephen, was that when you make that choice, I think you're talking about bringing your own plate to the potluck. Other people see it, right? And so it's there's the action we take that makes some difference, and then there is the network, the web that we're all part of together. That when we take an action within it, it sparks reactions and responses. That action is mirrored back to us by others around us, and that's the purpose of our show here. That's part of the reason we're recording this and sharing it with folks, is that we're trying to encourage certain ways of being within ourselves and within the cohort of folks that are engaged with this podcast and just around similar topics in general in the world. And so, I think it is, as Rahul said, there's no silver bullet, but this is the process. This is the way. Being engaged in the types of works that you're engaged in, Stephen, having conversations about it. It's beautiful to have the children named and present, and their interest in a healthier world. And so, yeah, so I mean, with all that in mind, I guess I'm curious, Stephen, if you have any kind of last thought or a core takeaway, and if you wanted listeners, upon listening to this interview and hearing it, to have one takeaway from this conversation that they can apply in their own lives, what would you want that to be? What would you want to share with them?
It reminds me of a part of the story that I wanted to share at the beginning when I was talking about setting out to attempt to grow my own food, that I had this grand vision that I kept a secret because I didn't even know if I could do it. And what unfolded, what blossomed, what came to fruition was so far grander than my wildest dreams. The abundance of food that I grew, I'll never forget the first bed of vegetables I grew. They were so gorgeous I couldn't even pick them. And I finally made myself because I'm like, I grew this to eat. I got to eat this food. And it was the most, it's like I'd never tasted broccoli in my life. It was the opposite of that, like cold, hard stuff that you'd have to dip in the ranch dressing. Otherwise, it's not even edible, on the platter. It was like candy. It was just tender, sweet. And every vegetable I ate, it was like the first time I was eating it. And I felt so rich. I felt like the richest man with my lot. And I have these pictures of me holding just oodles of chard and kale leaves. And I will never forget feeling that abundance. This backyard would, in a couple years, come to be known. I started to call it the Wynbrandt farm. And now my company is Wynbrandt Farms. The original Wynbrandt farm, the backyard of my mom's house, I still grow lots of food there and make compost there. And I named it the Wynbrandt farm because my parents in the 70s bought this little home. They thought it would just be their first home. My dad got sick with cancer and died when I was 3 years old. My grandparents helped my mom pay off the house. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to keep it. And I was so blessed to be able to be raised in this house with this big backyard that I could kick the soccer balls around and archaeological dig and do all the stuff that I did outside all the time, build tree houses. And so I named it the Wynbrandt farm, paying homage to my parents, to my dad who worked his ass off to be able to buy this house, to my mom who was his partner and they were so in love, and that she gave me her blessing to take over this backyard, to transform it, and then to bring tens of thousands of pounds of cow shit into it. And like, how incredible, how blessed am I? And so what I mean to say in this entire story is, whether you're 12 years old or you're 90, and by the way, both those ages and everyone in between and on all sides of that have lots of stuff and wisdom to teach me. But if I were to say this, regardless of age, when you are charmed to learn more about something and to go and just set out and do something or take a risk or dive into something, if you're charmed, follow that charm, because you never know where it could lead to. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined that this setting out to grow my own food would become a career and a central passion and a calling and a mission, and that it would develop into being. I became obsessed with making compost, this medicine, this gold, this black gold for the living skin of the earth. And now I'm creating these programs that are the first of their kind, nothing like them, that I've taken this highly specialized, rare knowledge I have with working with tens of thousands of pounds of ingredients by hand. The only other folks who do this do it with huge machinery and don't have the same kind of intimacy and understanding as I do, that I'm able to now apply this to say, hey, organizations, here's how you can handle tens of thousands of pounds of food waste on your land, not have to turn it so it's 90% less labor. It's not going to smell. You don't have to separate anything. Meat, dairy, bread, everything goes in And it's almost like at the end of Back to Future when Doc like pours a beer in and like the DeLorean can be powered by anything. It's like you put all this stuff in, you got to do it in an exacting way. I'm going to teach you how, break it down into really doable steps for lay people to do. And if you follow exactly how I do it, and don't worry, I'm going to be around all the time to make sure you're doing it right. You are going to be the first organizations for surely in LA, probably on the West Coast of the United States, likely the United States, possibly the world, that does this all on site in a way that for the first time makes it possible for organizations to take ultimate responsibility for their food waste and transform it on site in a way that's doable, in a way that's not an extraordinary laborious feat. And so there are no, it's 100% pest resistant. It doesn't smell. There are no flies. There's no turning. All these, it takes down all the barriers to entry. And so with all this, I'm saying this all came out of like, I wanted to grow food in my backyard. And so just follow that charm, follow what you're curious about and what you're passionate about, because you never know how it could unfold and blossom. And my final thought for compost is we can see things as good and as evil. And I learned this, Thierry, I learned this in the farming fellowship that I was in with Gabe. And our teacher, Shamu, said, we can see things as good and as evil, or we can see that everything has potential for good. And so in that food waste, in these schools' food waste, that's like mushy pasta and rice and beans and tortillas and calzones, that I can't wait. I'm counting down the months until the first batches of compost are ready. And the kids all know that what they put in there was a slimy, gooey, stinky mess that they wouldn't even want to touch with their hands, into this silky, sweet, smells like the forest floor, medicine for the earth. It grows their food, compost. And when they see that, and the teachers and the administration see that, these schools that have dared to be the first schools to sign on to this first of its kind program, that's where I'm like, we're changing the world.
It's so beautiful, Stephen. Yeah, it's beautiful to hear. Shout out to Shamu. We'll have to send in this episode. Just shout out to his presence here. And it's very powerful hearing the emotion of it and the message that you're communicating. And on that note, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. It's been so nice having you on the show. And, I think Rahul and I spent a lot of time for this episode thinking about usually we talk about topics of spirituality and how are we going to talk about compost, and it's all, I feel it's all very, very related. It's all intimately intertwined, but sometimes it's not as apparent from the outside. And I'm personally really happy that we got to do this. So thank you, first of all, for joining us today. It's awesome having you.
Thank you, brother. I thought of one more thing on the topic of spirituality that I want to offer. It's in our different books in different ways. One in the tradition that I was raised in Judaism, in the Torah, in what some know as the Old Testament, that the first human's name is Earthling. The first human's name is Adam. In Hebrew, that's Adam. Adam is from Adamah. Adamah is ground, earth. The farming fellowship that we did is called the Adamah Fellowship. Dam in Hebrew is blood. Earth, blood, Adamah, Adam, Adam. The first human's name at the beginning of the first story is Earthling. And we are made from earth. Literally, we're earth. The microbes are the same. We're made of earth. We are going back to the earth. When our body dies, it decomposes, it composts. The most broken down that organic matter can get, I said this word earlier, humus is the most broken down particles of organic matter. When we return to ourselves, when we return to who we really are, we are humble. Humus, human humility. And that is one core piece of my own spirituality, of my connection to the divine that runs through everything that runs through me and you and our soil, these sources that sustain us. A spiritual piece of what compost and the action of compost, and that we are compost of what that is for me.
Rahul, is there anything you want to share before we close for today?
Just that I appreciate your sharing that, Stephen. I think it was a very beautiful message in addition to everything you've already offered. And thank you. Thank you from my end as well, just for being a part of this.
It was such a pleasure to talk with both of you this afternoon. And I love your podcast and listen to your podcast. So it's an extra special pleasure to be on here as a guest.
So on that note, if you are listening to this, I hope it's been inspiring for you, especially as Stephen tied it together there. We are all in the process, we are all of the earth and we're returning to the earth. And so may this composting get moving in your own life for, literally composting your food waste and green waste. And then also in the broader metaphor that we've talked about today, the composting process of closing those loops of finding alchemy, turning things to good from whatever state that they're in, and following the sparks of inspiration that Stephen so beautifully demonstrated for us today. And so on that note, we just want to thank you again for joining us. We hope it's inspiring and insightful for you. That's always our goal. If there's something you'd like to see highlighted on this show, reach out to us. Let us know. If there's someone that should be a guest on our show, let us know. And we are so grateful to be coming up on a full year of recording this show and continuing to evolve it and move it along. So on that note, Stephen, I just give thanks to you again for joining us. Rahul, it is always a real pleasure to work on these episodes with you and host them together with you. And for folks listening, thank you so much. You're who keeps us going and keeps us inspired to keep providing this material in the world. So on that note, we're wishing you well. And get composting. Enjoy the process. Roll up the sleeves, get your hands dirty, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one.